Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be building a forest. I wanted these forest nodes to be super dense with a lot of vines and fallen trees. For wargaming purposes, I wanted these to be impassable and provide light cover. Prior to starting this project, I had never made trees before, so I did a bit of YouTube research as one does and combined some of the techniques I found there with some of my own ideas. For most of the standing trees, I used woodland scenic tree armatures. These things are pretty awesome. They are fairly cheap and come in several sizes. They're mainly intended for model railroading, but they're a good size for wargaming as well. They come with a detachable base, which is a nice option to have, or you can just skip the base completely and skewer them into the ground. So I carefully removed the mold lines and injection points. No need to be super picky with these. The leaves will cover up most of the branches anyway. I found myself just cleaning off the main trunk and skipping the mold lines on the branches altogether. When forming the branches, you have to twist the tree to spread the branches out. It helps to look at the tree from a top-down perspective. Once you have a good spread of branches, work on the individual branches, creating a cascading limbs effect. For this project, the bases are set up on a loose triangular grid. I started out with equilateral triangles and rounded them off a bit so the grid was a little bit less obvious, but it is there. I did 2 batches of terrain. For the first batch, I used 2 base sizes, those rounded triangles and a rounded diamond shape, which is just 2 triangles together. That way you can set them up side by side to create a larger forest area, or set them up individually. Note how the edges of the bases line up with the edges of the trees. I did that for modular purposes and also for easy storage because I suspected that these were going to be fairly delicate. I don't normally talk about storage, but for this project I feel like it's a pretty high priority. Since there's really no way to harden these trees up, they will always retain that flexibility, and so storage is even more important than it would be with like most of the other stuff I've done. So using my cardboard templates, I traced and cut a few bases out of a sheet of hardboard, and I finally started saving my sawdust. I've used this hardboard and also MDF on so many projects, and I have not been saving it up until this point. You gotta save that. That stuff is fantastic for flocking. And also ground cover. Next I beveled the edges with my Dremel, and at this point I made a huge mistake. I mixed up some Sculptamold and applied it directly to the bases. This stuff doesn't really stick to wood, and it's definitely not going to hold these trees in place. It will, however, cause these 1/8" pieces of hardboard to warp, and over the next 2 days, that's what they did. More on that later. While that was warping, I sculpted some downed, decaying trees and stumps using air dry clay and tinfoil. Stumps often have a split in the bark that goes all the way down to the ground, exposing the inner parts of the tree. And in most cases, they will be pretty decayed. I don't know if that goes without saying or not, but if a tree has fallen down for whatever reason, obviously it's not doing so well. Just use reference pictures if you are struggling with getting them to look right, or go for a hike and observe them in their natural habitat, like I did several times during the course of this project. For the downed trees, I used tinfoil to get the basic shape and layered air dry clay on top of that. The tinfoil has some pretty good texture on it that kind of looks like a tree anyway, so I didn't completely cover it up. I just kind of used my best judgment with that. Here's the first batch I did. I also wanted to try making my own trees with wire armatures. I used a lock wire and 24 gauge wire for these, but you could pretty much use any wire as long as you can bend it with your hands. I wrapped them around a foot-long piece of wood and then cut the ends to get several pieces of similar lengths. Then I twisted them together to make branches, and twisted those branches together to make trees. I made one tree with just wires, which I did not film, but you will see that tree later. I also made this monstrosity. I was testing to see if you could use paper as the core for a thicker tree. I coated the wire armatures with paintable acrylic latex. This stuff works pretty well and it's pretty cheap. However, it is not fast drying. It claims that it takes 2 hours to dry, but it actually took about a day per coat. Avoid touching this stuff with your bare hands and work in a well-ventilated area. Gloves are definitely a must for this. I ended up applying 2 coats of that acrylic latex on the trees. It clings to the wire pretty well and remains flexible once it's dry. And once again, you want to make sure that it's paintable. As far as smoothing it out, I mostly just used my fingers to do that. Back to these warped bases. To salvage the bases, I scraped that Sculpt-A-Mold off. I then soaked the bases in water and weighed them down while they dried to get them to sit flat again. Then I scored each base like I should have done in the first place and began gluing down the various trees and stumps with good old reliable construction adhesive. I also scored the underside of the Woodland Scenic stumps for a stronger bond. There's that wire tree I was talking about earlier. Since this is a forest in decay, I did cut a few limbs off. This is a great way to add some variety to your forest. You know, since most trees in nature aren't perfectly manicured, Sculpt-A-Mold creates a nice texture. I'd suggest letting it dry on a non-porous surface and then gluing it down once it's dry, like I'm doing here. I think I probably could have avoided the warping if I would have sealed the hardboard first. I used some scrap foam pieces to make some boulders for some of the nodes, just trying to create like a little mini diorama on each node. Once I had all that stuff glued down, I covered the exposed hardboard with wood glue, then I sprinkled small rocks and sand on top of that. Be sure to cover the exposed foam with wood glue as well at this point. I glued the Woodland Scenic trees onto their bases and used air dry clay to sculpt some roots and hide that join line around the base of the trunk. To create finer branches and vines, I used jute twine and manila rope. The manila rope can be cut into small pieces and broken apart to create hundreds of small branches and twigs.
Billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions
And this jute twine can be split into 3 smaller strands, which look a lot like vines to me. I decided to try Gorilla Spray adhesive for this part. I'd suggest spraying this stuff outdoors if it's an option. I directed the spray into a box, but the surrounding floor did still end up getting a bit tacky for a few days, so don't underestimate that overspray. And it doesn't really have much of an odor, but you should still definitely wear a mask when using it. The spray adhesive method works alright, but it doesn't really give you a lot of surface area to work with, and it's kind of hard to control. For a wild, unkept forest look, this method works pretty well though, and it didn't really take much time at all. So I gave the foam rocks a quick coat of Mod Podge and gray paint and moved on to the base coating. I found these camo paints which were perfect for this. They bond to plastic, dry ultra flat, and they even blend in with terrain. So nice of Rust-Oleum to make this product with terrain makers in mind, right? I blended the brown and green together, as you can see here, applying the green more to the bottom parts of the trees and the ground. Next, I dry brushed the nodes with a light brown. And added a wash. Now for the fun part. I have several strains of the good stuff here. Some chunks, coarse and fine grade flock, some grass, which I ended up not even using because I don't have a static grass applicator, and I'm already way over budget on this build, and De Belle of Debal, the sweet, sweet hardboard sawdust. The sawdust gave the nodes a nice pop of color. Originally, I wasn't going to use clump foliage on these trees, but I tried doing a tree without the clump foliage and I felt like it looked really flat, so I ended up using it to give the trees a bit more volume. It took a little bit of a trial and error to get my process figured out, but once I got it figured out, the process looked a little bit like this. First, I would sprinkle sawdust on the branches, then I would stick a few clumps on the branches, then I would sprinkle coarse flock on top of that, followed by fine flock if I had a lighter color to highlight it with, and I hit them with spray adhesive between each layer. If you have a lighter fine flock to use as a highlight for your leaves, that seems to be the thing to do. But I found that there isn't really a lighter flock option to use for the light green clumps, so I just did my best. And personally, I don't think it really makes that much of a difference if they have highlights or not. I added some clumps as ground cover, and I also applied a few tufts in lieu of static grass. And I used a few speed paints here and there to add a bit of color variety. Finally, I mixed a DIY scenic cement using a recipe I found online, and I don't really have enough experience yet with this to comment on how well it works. I had some issues with the clumps falling off. I think it was reactivating the Gorilla Glue, but I'm not quite sure. But after the first coat, that wasn't really an issue. I gave them 2 coats of that DIY cement. I know some people aren't really huge fans of clump foliage, but I think I made it work here. I think using it alongside the sawdust and flock really helped. Yeah, they aren't ultra realistic, but for wargaming terrain, I think they look pretty good. I'm really looking forward to using these. Now, I mentioned that I did 2 batches of these. For the second batch, I used larger triangular bases. I didn't bother sculpting the roots for the trees. I just glued them in place. I also didn't use nearly as much paint. I relied more on the flock for those. And at a distance, I think they pretty much look the same. So there's a few steps you could probably skip if you want to. So thanks for tuning in. I hope this video was helpful, if not entertaining. There are some links below if you want to support the channel. Check them out. I hope you have a good day, and I will see you later.